Good evening. Good evening and welcome to this Gotham Center event. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. If this is your first time with us, I invite you to learn more about the Gotham Center online at gothamcenter.org, where you can find digital exhibits, dozens of podcasts, hundreds of recorded interviews and panel discussions, and over 800 articles, book reviews, and more on all things New York City history. Those of you looking for a deeper dive may also be interested in our new online education program, Gotham Ed. You can view past courses, and very shortly we'll be posting the calendar for next academic year at gothamed.com. Tonight, as part of our regular series of free book talks featuring the best and most interesting new research on New York City history, we'll be discussing Andrew Meyer's recent multi-generational biography of the Morgenthau family. I doubt with this audience that I need to recount the highlights of their story. The Morgenthaus had aristocratic eminence in New York for generations, and like so many of the families which dominate the city's history, they also had great national and global influence as well. While the names of Morgan, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and Gould are perhaps more familiar, Henry Morgenthau Sr. was one of the first to establish a corporate trust during the industrial era, as our speaker notes. He built a fortune in New York City real estate and then moved into politics, joking once that he bought the local Democratic machine for $30,000. And investing early in Woodrow Wilson's presidential election, with party operators referring to the faithful financier as Uncle Henry. His son, Henry Morgenthau Jr., became unexpectedly the most famous of the bunch. An old neighbor and friend of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who sat as treasurer of the New Deal and World War II before ending as one of the major architects of Bretton Woods, which, among other things, established New York City as the financial capital of the world. Robert Morgenthau served as New York's longest-running district attorney, the ubiquitous presence on television prosecuting thousands of mobsters, business criminals, corrupt government officials, and other thugs between 1975 and 2009. To know their story is to know the history of the city and of the nation for the last 150 years. And in this new book, Andrew Meyer has managed to capture seemingly all of it in brisk, clean, intelligent prose that will not disappoint. It is a massive work of 900 pages, so I do not want to take any more time away from this discussion. But allow me first to briefly introduce our speaker and our discussant this evening. Andrew Meyer is the author of the previous award-winning books Black Earth, A Journey Through Russia After the Fall, and The Lost Spy, An American in Stalin's Secret Service. Both were named to a number of Book of the Year lists. A former Moscow correspondent for Time, Andrew has contributed to numerous national and international periodicals for more than 20 years, and his work has been recognized by several prestigious fellowships and institutions. Susie J is Associate Professor of History at St. John's University and the author of Gentlemen Bankers, The World of J.P. Morgan, published by Harvard University Press in 2003. She serves as trustee of the Business History Conference, co-chair of the Columbia University Economic History Seminar. She's a member of the editorial advisory board of the Business History Review, and she has served on the Financial History editorial board since 2017. In her generosity between these many other obligations, she also serves as one of the contributing editors of the Gotham Center's blog for scholars of New York City history. I'm extremely pleased to welcome both of these very talented and accomplished historians to the Gotham Center this evening, and I will turn things over to Susie now. First, the usual bit of housekeeping. As always, presentation and discussion will last until about 7:30 or so, at which point we will take your questions. However, and we have disabled the chat function out of respect to our speakers. However, I encourage you to send in questions at any time during the next hour using the Q&A icon that appears at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So with that, please join me in welcoming our guests with a bit of silent applause.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. And hello, Andrew, and welcome. I want to first really congratulate you on the epic achievement that is your book, which I got actually in December and have been reading. I thought I'd start off by saying that I know as Peter said, your previous books were both on Russia. So can you tell us a little bit about the journey from the work that you had done before to you working for over a decade researching and writing about the Morgenthau family?
Thank you, Susie, and thank you, Peter. It was a beautiful introduction. And thank you all who are joining us on this rather, at least in Brooklyn, New York, where Susie and I are, this rather extraordinarily beautiful out there evening. Susie, thank you. Thank you for the marathon read as well. I had been in Moscow, as Peter said, for 6 years working for Time, and then I went back for many years until very recently for the New York Times Magazine. And I had actually turned to New York City politics. And one of the first places I went to was the Gotham Center. And then I had the good fortune of being at the Leon Levy Center, which is also at the Graduate Center, of course. I was looking towards New York politics, and I started, I did a very long spent, far too many months looking at the mayoral campaign when the first campaign that Bill de Blasio won. And obviously was fascinated by the maelstrom, the defoliated landscape that Michael Bloomberg's terms in office left in New York. And I was looking to do a second biography. The first book, Black Earth, is really a history of Russia in the first 10 years after the Soviet fall. The second book was a biography of a 1920 Columbia College graduate named Isaiah Oggins, who became a member of the Comintern and then a Soviet spy. And then, to give away the ending, was killed on Stalin's personal orders. I had been chasing ghosts in that book for about 5 years in the Oggins book, The Lost Spy. And so when I was looking at New York City politics, I looked at Bloomberg. Turns out Mike Bloomberg, whatever your political stripes, had an amazing, obviously a brilliant career on Wall Street, but he's essentially, in his own words, a nice Jewish boy from outside Boston. There isn't the great sweep of history in his biography. I looked at a few other people. I had the pleasure of having an office in Washington next to Senator Moynihan, Peter's subject. I'm looking forward to that book. And a friend of mine had said, you know, the DA is 89 years old, Robert Morgenthau. And in the recesses of my mind, I knew the name Morgenthau. My father was an economist. I can't say that I grew up, you know, studying the Morgenthau diaries, as though many of our audience probably knew the Morgenthau diaries, which were published, a 3-volume set, which were really seminal in the late 50s, early 60s, was John Morton Blum's synopsis. They're back there, 3-volume, fantastically, beautifully written, and it's a summary of 890 something volumes that are up in Hyde Park at the Roosevelt Library. I had heard that Secretary Morgenthau, obviously the New Deal, something about the Morgenthau plan, but I had no idea that the DA at 89 was still the DA of New York County. Long story short, I went to go see him. And in preparation for that, it was a bit of a ruse. I was writing for the Times Magazine, as I said, and he really wasn't interested in another magazine profile. And I had read Lazarus Morgenthau's, something of a diary. It's a life history. It's at the New York Public Library. It's called a Lebensgeschichte, that at the ripe age of 27 in 1842, the patriarch who first came to Brooklyn, New York, in 1866, that he had written. And when I read that, I thought, there's something more here than just the life of the DA, which is, you know, there will be other biographies, I hope, written just of the DA. There have been and there will be other biographies of his father, Henry Jr., who was the Treasury Secretary, one of the longest serving cabinet members in US history. And then Henry Sr., someone probably closer to your period, at least in your first book, who was the real estate magnate, and as Peter said, he claimed to have bought the Democratic Party for Woodrow Wilson. I knew nothing about Lazarus, the former cigar baron, who was sort of the first Morgenthau, the patriarch, to come here in 1866. And when I learned about that, and when I met the DA, I thought, as you said, the long arc, 4 generations, it appealed to me. Of course, it appealed to Morgenthau, the DA. It was unauthorized. He never asked to read a page. No one in the family asked to read a page. But of course, I had no idea how many mountains I was going to have to climb over the next decade. But I wanted to do something very different, and I was really looking for a New York story that had a great sweep.
Are you a native New Yorker, by the way? Is that one of the?
No, I'm a Californian, and just the way I spent half of my life learning Russian and developing fluency and going to Russia, and I was there all told about a decade living in Russia. I am the same. I've been here now since coming back from Moscow the week of 9/11. So it's been a few years. And it was a way to kind of learn about the city. And one of the beautiful things about speaking on this book for me is I get to hear so many different constituencies and so many different stakeholders in this epic. And I spoke on Wall Street, and I realized sort of as I was speaking, wait a minute, we are on the ground that Henry Morgenthau helped to build. We are in the edifice across from 25 Broadway, the old Rockefeller, Standard Oil headquarters, and so many of those buildings of Wall Street, and then moving forward, which we'll, I hope, talk about as Manhattan grew north. Morgenthau was either had the lead in the syndicate of it, or actually owned and sold all the way up to northern Manhattan and the Bronx. And so, yeah, so it's really been a way for me to learn the history of New York as well.
I mean, even for me, learning the scope of his real estate empire and how far back he went was really surprising. That actually leads to two questions that you kind of touched on already, which is, you know, you've talked a little bit about your sources and the research process. I always love the footnotes and the sources at the end. I mean, I just was astounded by the amount of research that you had done. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that was like and how you got access to the family. I mean, even getting a meeting with Bob Morgenthau to begin with, or anything you wanted to, you know, to kind of share about how, if it was very difficult or what was kind of the most challenging things. And also if there was, what did you learn while writing the book that surprised you?
Yeah, well, so I'll start with the paper trail. With the Ogden story, The Lost Spy, that began literally with a whisper. I was up in Norilsk in the far north, the Arctic of Russia. I'd gone twice. I spent 1 month up there, where it gets to, I don't know, -60 Celsius at the worst. And Norilsk was one of the main islands of Stalin's Gulag archipelago. And I was interviewing survivors of the Gulag, some who had actually survived both camps, Stalin's and Hitler's. And there was a whisper. And, you know, as a historian, you can appreciate this. They said there was an American here. And I was obviously writing for Time magazine at the time. And I kept that whisper in my mind. You can't forget something like that. And then when I was already leaving Time, I thought, oh, that could be a book. Many years later, I went back and I investigated that and did what I pretentiously call investigative nonfiction as an amateur historian without a PhD. And the Ogden's trail, the paper trail, I would look for initials, almost palimpsests, whether they were photographic or archival imprints of the past that had been deliberately erased, the Gulag, okay? I did get into the KGB archives and other formerly Soviet archives, but these were shards, both shards of memory, but shards of the archive. Morgenthau, and I said I didn't want to chase ghosts. Morgenthau, early on, I knew would be a monumental task just because of those Morgenthau diaries, the Treasury years, which are not diaries in the common sense. They were his in and out box. And the woman, who I like to give her due, which is impossible, Henrietta Klotz was probably the longest serving public servant to be invisible in the history of the US Treasury. And actually, I'm invited to go back and give a talk to the Treasury next month. And I'm going to talk about Henrietta Klotz, who I think actually will get her biography. She's the woman who sat at Henry Morgenthau's side
Yeah, she's a
And
wonderful character in the book.
oh, and her daughter, I think, is alive and well. I interviewed her daughter, and there's quite a bit of correspondence in the archives up in Hyde Park. But the Morgenthau diaries are from her fingertips. She was typing in the corner, she was typing every meeting. So any historian of the New Deal knows this. She would even type in her own comments, which were not infrequent and often incisive. So anyone who was he also had a taping mechanism. He was the first one to tape the president. He taped Truman. He didn't tape, that we know, he didn't tape Roosevelt. But anytime he met with Roosevelt, which was every Monday, he had a private lunch with the president. And that began in as early as the 1920s, if not 1912, when he officially first met him. There's this paper record. So we're talking about millions of pieces of paper. I won't move the monitor, but you have an extensive library. My library at home is taken over by the banker's boxes. And I do this with every book, as every writer does. It's all about the paper. And as my partner likes to say, it's all right there. Why do you need to go to another archive? And of course, she's right. Millions of papers, millions of pieces of paper at Hyde Park. And then his father, Henry Sr., who was known in the Democratic Party as the Moneybags, Uncle Henry, FDR, and Al Smith, and everyone who looked to Henry Morgenthau Sr., the real estate magnate, for money. Both Democrats and Republicans called him Uncle Henry. He also he never let a piece of paper leave his grasp. So there are chits and ticket stubs and autographs and notes, and then not just the speech he gave, but the 7 drafts beforehand. And then there's the ghost-written memoirs. You get the picture.
Yeah. So you have an embarrassment of riches. It's like the opposite of chasing the ghost.
Yes. So it is exactly the opposite. Lazarus was more difficult. He was a ghost, and I learned to kind of like find him in memoirs and letters. But the most difficult thing, which was really the challenge, and we always look for the challenge, was what Alice Mayhew, the great late editor, said to me. What about the women? And the women were the challenge. And I hope, and I've been so gratified that readers are finding the women as living, vivid, incredibly gifted, intelligent characters who were not just off stage. In each successive generation, down to the DA, from Lazarus on. Lazarus's wife, Babette Guggenheim Morgenthau, in 23 years, 14 children. And that was really the least of her troubles. He was her biggest burden, Lazarus. It was very difficult, as you can imagine, to find letters, to find the archival, whether they were state or private documents. But I was able to, and that really was the greatest reward. So they each married up, both financially and I think in terms of talent. The future Secretary of the Treasury married a Lehman. So you had the Morgenthau and the Lehman. The Morgenthaus were not at that time great German Jews of our crowd. They were on the edge of our crowd, although, which is, I think in the book, the DA's aunt coined the term our crowd. Which doesn't really have the resonance it did in New York City even 20 years ago. But our crowd, of course, is the German Jews, largely in Manhattan. And it was Eleanor Fatman, who was a Lehman, who really brought money. She also brought incredible talent to the family. And she's the woman I could find in the archives who was writing notes about going upstate, which was, as it still is, entrenched Republican turf, with her friend Eleanor Roosevelt, and going to women.
About her relationship with Eleanor, which was really
right. And that's where, to answer your question in a roundabout way, I would go to historians. You have this mountain of, many mountains of paper, and sometimes it's needle in a haystack, and sometimes it's going to a historian like John Morton Blum and saying. And he was obviously incredibly gracious and generous, or Blanche Wiesen Cook at the Graduate Center. You can do what I couldn't do, or here's a shortcut, or this is the essential story you need to tell, or here's the thing I could never puzzle out. What do you think about that? And that's why it's so great to hear that. I haven't counted them, 100 plus 150 pages of footnotes. I don't know.
Yeah, it's
My
amazing. I mean,
my copy editor said, you've committed, she was brilliant, is brilliant. She said, you've committed the sin of over documentation. But that's why I did it. Those are the breadcrumbs I'm leaving for people, who, the book is so crazily expansive. Peter was very charitable, from the making of New York to the Armenian genocide to be elliptical here, to the New Deal, to the Holocaust, to 50 years of law and order in New York. There's so many different people come to it. And that's why I really wanted to have that source material as comprehensive as possible.
well, is there anything that you wanted to have in the book, people that you wanted to talk to that you weren't able to get access to?
It's a great question. Not in terms of access. I waited out. I think the woman who holds the record was Sonia Sotomayor. When I first met the DA, he was a great mumbler. And one of our first interviews, which I was already doing the book, and it wasn't authorized, but he kind of knew what I was up to. I learned very early on that this was about power, and this was about the people who occupy the corner offices in Manhattan very high up, whether they be private or public offices, and that there's a closed circle, which continues to this day. What I'm saying now will be reported back, obviously not to the DA, but to the circle. There's a closed circle of the Morgenthau army. And I would go see somebody, and then I might mention something in an interview. Like, one of the early knocks on Morgenthau was that he didn't try a case in court. Alvin Bragg is now our current DA in Manhattan, is taking a hit for appearing in court. Cyrus Vance, his predecessor, for 12 years, often went to court, physically went into court. Morgenthau rarely did that. So I posed that question to somebody. The next day I got it in the mail, a several hundred-page brief of when Morgenthau took on and won the chief judge of the state of New York. His point being, I did go to court personally, and he did argue that case personally. So there was the closed circuit. So it wasn't a question of not getting access. It was a question of making sure that I wasn't crossing wires, put it that way. He mumbled something about, you ought to go see Sonia Sotomayor. This is how long I was on the book, pre-Obama's nominating Justice Sotomayor to the Supreme Court. And I just did a stupid thing. I just didn't go see her. Obviously, when she was nominated, I thought, I should talk to her. I think I waited 6 years, and then I spent a long, incredible, indelible afternoon, and we've had a correspondence that lasts to this day, which I don't quote her extensively in the book, but she absolutely informed my thinking about the DA, and not just about the DA. She informed my thinking about that great suite, the Four Generations, because, as many of our audience knows, he was not only her personal mentor, he was something of the New York and professional and personal muse in her career, and she writes extensively and eloquently about that in her memoir.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the theme of power, because when I was reading your book, I actually went back to look at Robert Caro's The Power Broker. I think that, just given the scale of your book, the kind of parallels to the Robert Moses story and his, the theme of power is in the title. It's so strong in his book. And you absolutely get that with the Morgenthau Dynasty. But I wanted to ask, what is the central idea that you wanted to convey in the book? What that you wanted other people to read and receive?
It's a great question, and I don't have a perfect answer. There are about three halves of that answer, and one is definitely, anytime you write about a New York politician. And despite what Alvin Bragg says, it is a political office, the district attorney. His father held a cabinet post, as I said, one of the longest cabinet members in U.S. history, but he wasn't really a politician. And Henry Morgenthau Sr. always stood to the side. He was always at Roosevelt's right-hand side during every cabinet meeting, and they did campaign upstate. That was their every single election. They did campaign sweeps together. But he was certainly not a glad-hander. He was a horrible speech maker. He was, Roosevelt called him Henry the Morgue. He was a glower. He was a hand-wringer. He was a terrible politician. And his grandfather, the DA's grandfather, Henry Sr., was a natural politician, but in those days, he was given the Jewish seat. He became the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And that is what Oscar Strauss previously had been, the first Jewish cabinet member, actually, in US history. But Henry Sr. had a chip on his shoulder, still had the German diphthongs, could never become a full American. And when you get to the DA, to answer your question, it's Power, Privilege, and the Rise of an American Family. That's the subtitle. I have to remember it because I really wrestled with the word privilege, not power. I knew anytime you write about politics in New York, you're in the shadow of Robert Caro. And privilege is the epigraph to the book that Henry Sr., Uncle Henry, moneybags, real estate man who is always searching for self-discipline and finding it, and also searching and worshiping at the altar of the almighty dollar, making New York, making world history, getting moral authority, speaking to the outrages of what wasn't called genocide, but the mass murder of the Armenians that he bore witness to. He's entering the political class. He's moving from the outside of that German Jewish world in his evolution, about which I knew very little, because it's burnished through successive ghostwritten memoirs. Henry Sr. had always bought the best historians and journalists and paid them very well. By the time you get to the DA, his grandfather says, and this is the epigraph, I had to wait until I was 50, until I had independence. He had a couple $1 million, which was quite something, as you know, until I was old enough, 51, I think 52, to enter public service. But you don't. He's admonishing his grandson. He admonished all of his grandchildren. Barbara Tuchman was also a granddaughter of Henry Morgenthau's. And he said, you don't, and that's a privilege. And that's the sense of privilege, is that public service. Of course, that's a euphemism. It's really about entering the political class. It's really about grabbing power. It's really about coming from the outside, the classic immigrant story, and not just joining the melting pot, but rising to the top of that. And
Yeah.
that's really, to answer your question, the third part, an American family. That was really always my working title, an American family, because that's the way they saw themselves. They didn't see themselves as Jews. They didn't see themselves as Jewish Americans. They didn't see themselves even as New Yorkers. They didn't see themselves, all of this is, of course, the mosaic. But the gospel of America, our Zion is here. Henry Morgenthau Sr. is infamous, famous, known as the great anti-Zionist. He took out full-page ads in newspapers. He wrote screeds against Zionism, which is a long and complicated history. And then his son arguably becomes the greatest friend of Israel, takes Golda Meir on her first fundraising tour across the country, raises $50 million for the Haganah and arms, the first American aid to Israel. It wasn't even Israel yet in 1948. At any rate, our Zion is here, the American gospel. That's what the DA believed as well. Yes, he was a friend of Israel. Yes, Ed Koch made him do the bidding of building and then running the Museum of Jewish Heritage, the Holocaust Museum downtown Manhattan. But it really was about America. Almost, they were Democrats through and through. but there's a great civic pride, and that's the privilege and the power. And there are a lot of people who kind of are taken aback, if not umbrage, when I say that the DA shouldn't be a DA for life. I think it's a very healthy thing to have rotation, and what we once called elections, free and fair elections in this country. I remember I spent a decade in Russia, but not to be glib about it. Morgenthau was introduced as the Pope of New York. He was introduced as DA for life, and maybe after. His shadow is felt right now with the Trump case every day. That's the privilege, and that is a kind of a power that really even has outlasted his life.
Well,
That's a long way of saying it's an imperfect answer, but that's what I want to take away. How can one family, and I really don't know, I'd love to crowdsource, what family in American history has had that level of political office, whether elected or not, for 150 years. And that is a reign, that is a long reign. I mean, of course, the Adams.
Well, of course, one of the families that you introduce in the book that really is parallel story to the Morgenthau, of course, is the Kennedys, right? So in Joseph Kennedy's ties to FDR. And then I was quite thrilled when I get to the, Henry Jr. story, that you see his relationship both with Jack Kennedy and with RFK, because I actually thought you could have written a parallel story between Joseph Kennedy's determination for his family to kind of reach a political seat in power, and then also Henry Sr. And both had been ambassadors, right? So one in the UK and the other in Constantinople. And so
sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, that's a great, thank you. That is, I knew it. That's one thread that I did know from the Sulzbergers, the family that have owned first the Ox and then the Sulzbergers that have owned the New York Times, are one great dynastic power family in New York that run parallel, and we're very close to the Morgenthaus throughout, which I hope and readers have responded to in the book. And that's about power and privilege as well, and the transactional nature that power multiplies in New York. The Kennedys, it's a very different relationship, but it also spans from the 1920s on. And I had a really hard time establishing, which is, I'm really gratified to hear, that they too run parallel. And it's very difficult to determine where it starts. But Rose Kennedy, Joe Kennedy, wife and then widow in her memoirs, she remembers. So there's not a contemporaneous account, but I was able to find some contemporaneous accounts, that it's actually Henry Jr. who brings old Joe, Joseph Kennedy, the patriarch, into the Roosevelt fold pre-1932. And he doesn't necessarily want to be there. And then for payback, for helping fund the Roosevelt campaign, he actually wants the Treasury job that falls to Henry Jr., who knew nothing about your world, nothing about Wall Street, nothing about finance. People say that Bobby Kennedy had the most expensive legal education as our youngest attorney general, the president's brother. But it was actually Henry Morgenthau who probably had the most expensive. He's the guy who sits over and surveys the Treasury at an exponential growth, not just the budget, but more than 30,000 employees. That drives Joe Kennedy nuts. And it's in most of the Kennedy books, whether it's about Bobby or Jack or their father. The Morgenthaus are seen, with the exception of the DA, as ne'er-do-wells, bumpkins. Why are they here? And of course, as Jews. And Joe Kennedy, old Joe, certainly is the rival. And then there's this strange confluence, which I suspect, but it's liminal in the letters and in the diaries. It's not clear that they show up at the Kennedy compound, just abutting the Kennedy compound, which is on Cape Cod, obviously, in the summers in the 1930s, when you've got masses of kids and they're racing sailboats. So the future DA is racing sailboats with the future president. And of course, in 1960, that comes home. They were also in the south of France twice, but once with the Kennedys on the eve of the war. Now, is that coincidence? I don't think so. But you'd kind of have to tease it out going from the archival and then from obviously people who were there. They were there, and so was Marlene Dietrich and Carpentier. So there is this rivalry, and then it culminates with JFK's presidency and Bob Morgenthau. It's funny, a lot of New Yorkers don't realize when, and I spoke on this recently, the Bronx and machine politics, how quickly we forget. Maybe in Brooklyn you don't forget as quickly, but Charlie Buckley was the indomitable boss of the Democratic Party in the district in the Bronx, and he was a national figure. Carmen DeSapio was not just a district leader in Greenwich Village; he was on the cover of Time magazine, and so these were the giants of the Democratic, bossism. And Morgenthau was instrumental. He wasn't alone in bringing that down. And Bobby Kennedy was all for it. His father had allegiance to Buckley and many of the old Irish Catholic clans that ruled New York. That's how Morgenthau first campaigns. He becomes head in Bronx for Kennedy, which was no small thing in JFK's campaign. And then as a reward, they weren't great friends. But as a reward, and this is one of the kind of fun chapters I was able to research, is that it's really Bobby Kennedy, who was too young during those sailboating days on the Cape. Bobby was so much younger. The DA didn't know him, the future DA, didn't remember him. But they actually had, and this is to your good question, a bond that was little known. All the books on Bobby Kennedy that fill half a shelf behind me, and there will be more. Morgenthau was with the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, the day that his brother was killed in Dallas. And that wasn't coincidental. As I lay out in the book, everyone who worked with Bobby Kennedy, everyone who worked with Morgenthau, I was able to interview, the received perception was that Bobby was going to move to a re-election campaign or to the State Department, and Morgenthau would have taken over as Attorney General. They were extremely close. And old Joe, by that point, the rivalry was just as strong, but he could only just watch it with, as you pointed out, Henry Jr. and Joseph Kennedy had an intense rivalry dating back to the 1930s.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in many ways, you had one Catholic family and one Jewish American family, but they were so similar, in terms of their kind of rise. And the fact that they vacationed together or, close to each other, they were in similar social circles.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that was deliberate. I think on Henry Jr.'s part, Henry Jr. had an extraordinary, he's in all the books of the New Deal and the Holocaust, but he's a kind of cardboard character. And I realized early on, I tried to, get some interiority to him. Who is this guy and what motivates him? He had an enormous, the Brits have this great word, chippy. He was the chippiest member, I think, of any cabinet. Mrs. Perkins would have blown him away, Frances Perkins, both in terms of her labor activism and her speaking abilities and in her strategic thinking. It was one of the reasons why Roosevelt liked him. He definitely was a proxy. But this is a guy who flunked out of boarding school and flunked out of Cornell, where he went to college, twice. He never had a high school degree.
Yeah, am I right in saying that there's the implication that he had a form of dyslexia that had?
I think, and again, that was where I just, was able to ask a historian who had spent personally face-to-face 15 years, and hopefully not every day, John Morton Blum, the great historian at Yale. He said, oh no, he had undiagnosed dyslexia. He used to do this strange ballet. It was a beautiful phrase, ballet with his glasses, because he couldn't read. He was nearsighted. But John Morton Blum said, I used these Morgenthau diaries. He said, I would read chapters to him because
Right.
he couldn't really, it wasn't just the eyesight. He couldn't
Right.
read a book cover to cover. He did read detective thrillers. I found those in the archives. But you know, when there were notes on documents and edits, those were his wife's. Those were Eleanor Morgenthau's notes. And I came to learn her handwriting. She was a fantastic editor and a great writer and a great speaker. He was none of that. But he did have the vision. So it wasn't just that he got Roosevelt's liquor during his bootleg liquor during Prohibition, which is a famous Henry Wallace quote. All of these guys during the New Deal, because they were so afraid of Roosevelt playing them off each other, which he did. I mean, the quote which is so often quoted, but it's true because it's in the diaries. Henry, Roosevelt to Morgenthau. The trick of management is very simple. It's kind of Stalinist. Never let your right hand know what your left hand is doing, and one hand I always keep under the table. And that was Roosevelt. He played them off each other. And I found that. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the idea about geography and proximity. When Roosevelt first appears, he's like as a neighbor, right, in upstate New York, in Henry Jr.'s life, and it got me to thinking about a question. And I think the obviously the proximity is one of these things. If you really describe the rise of this family, and if you were to make a general assessment, and then all the other characters who you talk about along the way, like the Kennedys or like the Sulzbergers, what do you think that the Morgenthau family's history says about the necessary conditions that you have to have, the institutional conditions for this kind of success, for this kind of familial rise? I mean, you have to be in the right places, the kind of proximity to the centers of power. In other words, when you think of the family's ascent and their acquisition of power, what do you think are the necessary conditions for making it in America?
You've hit the sweet spot of the book, and that's exactly. There is something. Many historians are sort of, I don't know, an infinite number of schools of biography. But I think to stand in their place, literally, whether it be Fishkill Farms, which is still in the Morgenthau family, the DA's youngest son is running it now and dedicating his life to it, which is in Dutchess County. And it's not contiguous to Hyde Park, the old Roosevelt estate, but it's about 20 minutes of sort of winding Dutchess County roads to it. They were neighbors. Roosevelt liked to say, Henry, you and I are the only two Democrats in a Republican county. Dutchess, of course, is changing a little bit, but it's swinging back and forth. There is the proximity there, without a question. And when we talk about power and privilege, that is not coincidental. It's not just proximate, it's deliberate. And the Morgenthau's, of course, grew up in a very different world than either Eleanor Roosevelt or Franklin D. grew up in. I mean, Eleanor writes in one of her letters, the Jew party was awful, it was ghastly. She grew up in a world where anti-Semitism was just, part of the oxygen. It was in the atmosphere. How she grows is obviously, to her credit, the most incredible in my estimation, the most incredible woman of the 20th century, if not ours as well, in American history. How the Morgenthau's grew is as well, from 2 blocks away from where I'm now sitting, Congress Street, the edge of the wharf, where cholera was rampant in Brooklyn, 1866, right after the war, right after the Civil War. Before consolidation of New York, Brooklyn is obviously the rising 4th or 5th largest city in the country, but it's also still largely dairy farms. They're being auctioned off. Why didn't they just end up on some patch of an old Dutch dairy farm? It's a great question. Yeah. It is a confluence of several things. And I really think this is what, the family embodies and is illustrative of. And it sounds corny, but it may in fact be ideally American. And of course, it's a 19th century story up until World War II. And it is out of the ashes. We haven't talked too much about it, and I've been galloping around. Apologies for those trying to keep track of the different Henrys. But Lazarus is an extraordinary character who was the cigar baron who rises from poverty to become a cigar baron in Germany and loses it all in the 1860s to the Lincoln tariffs. I'm writing this in the age of Trump. I'm writing and researching in the age of Trump, which may or may not be behind us. And tariffs are in the news. Well, Lincoln did exactly the same thing, as most of you know. Protectionism was at its rise. Lazarus Morgenthau went bust on that, selling German cigars to the 49ers in California. As improbable as that is, he made a mint, loses all of that, comes to New York, and then tries to fake it till he makes it. He actually never makes it, and he ends up poor, alone, with the sheriffs at his door, at the edge of at least eccentricity, if not criminality. Out of the ashes of the patriarch, it's kind of a reverse rag to riches, comes the real estate magnate. And he has a few things which are running throughout the generations, and it's to try to answer your question. He has self-discipline. He has incredible ego and ambition. I mentioned the ghostwriters and the preservation for history. As a young man, I mean, it's in the book, he's not just erasing his German diphthongs, he's also writing to history. He's writing, 8, 9, 10 years old, his American manifesto, his centennial in 1876. He's a teenager, and he's writing his centennial reminiscence. So the hubris, the ego is enormous. It's boundless, right? That sounds pretty much an American, American to the core, the kind of boundless enthusiasm for his own potential. But he also has something which is very different from Mannheim in the south of Germany. He imbibes Ben Franklin's 13 virtues. He sets his own virtues and tries to grow by them. He also studies Emerson, the study of the sublime, and that leads to this kind of ideal of public service and making the world, as corny as it sounds, a better place. That leads all the way through. Yes, it's joining the public class. Yes, it's power, but it's almost always for the women and the men of the successive 3 generations, for trying to better those who have less. And it really is an American ideal. They fall short, but they don't back away from the fight, whether it's the Armenians, whether it's the saving the last Jews of the Holocaust, or whether it's the Central Park jogger case. It's, yeah, that's really the core core set of ideals and I think it does come out of the ruins of, so it's the reverse. It's a little bit different than rags to riches. It's riches to rags, at least with the patriarch.
I really appreciate how you're talking about what it is that family members learn from their predecessors, because after having read the book, I really could understand why it was 900 pages, because there is this value of looking at over 150 years of history in this kind of epic detail, because what you're seeing is either learning or non-learning kind of being passed down through the generations. And when you feel like there's really no stone that's been unturned, you can really ask them, like, what is missing or what's not there. For example, okay, we have 10 more minutes. That discrimination is such a major theme in the book. I mean, given the experience of the family as a Jewish family onward, their experiences with anti-Semitism, and here and there are kind of mentions in the family about their feelings about interracial relations or ecumenical relations, right? There's Lazarus's speech in 1897, about, I think it was helping his fellow man regardless of race, religion, or other.
Right.
Henry Sr., you talk about as this kind of bridge between Jew and Gentile. And given that there's such a strong theme of discrimination, Henry Sr.'s outrage at of Jews being treated differently in the Jewish seat, being given the ambassadorship in Constantinople. The fact that the story of the family starts in Reconstruction, it goes through the Progressive Era, it goes through, did the Morgenthaus ever talk about Black Americans in their papers? I mean, they seem to have lived in a very segregated world, right? This kind of the world of where they vacationed and where they lived, and also, and it's so interesting, given the strong theme of discrimination against Jews, the Armenian genocide, for example, what Henry Sr. called a campaign of race extermination. What did the Morgenthaus think about the conditions of Black Americans at home? Do they ever talk about it? Is it in their records?
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
it's a great question, and it's one that I wrestled with a lot. Not just Alice Mayhew's, the editor's question, what about the women? I also thought, what about other people, other Americans?
Because it really appears for the first time in Bob. So you're at the fourth generation in Bob Morgenthau's story,
Right.
of the Second World War.
Well, it actually appears chapters were cut, and I can't blame anybody but myself. But other historians and readers have queried me, because one of the founders of the NAACP was a Morgenthau family member, and the Spingarn papers really. I'm going to have to be kind of telegraphic here, not deliberately, but in terms of time. The Spingarn papers hold a gold mine for anyone interested in the origins of the NAACP. But also, it really begins with what I was talking about, Ben Franklin, or maybe even Lazarus. You quoted it. Lazarus is this kind of impossible character. And in many ways, he's an eccentric. He was abusive, if not physically, but there's certainly strong indications he was physically abusive of his wife Babette, but at least verbally. He also is a bridge builder with then the Catholics and the Protestants in Germany. And when he comes here, he never really adapts, never really joins the melting pot. He's only in the German Jewish world, although he wasn't necessarily so spiritual to the Jewish faith. There's a kind of an ecumenical, you said it, and that's absolutely right. Whether it was the Hebrew orphan dowry or whether it was the New York City orphan dowry, he didn't necessarily care, Lazarus. His children, even more so, they married outside the faith. And this is a tradition that continues. It continued throughout the 1870s onwards. They're thrown into the public schools. They're thrown into the public schools, the New York public schools, the greatest melting pot, which at that time were not segregated by faiths, by race, of course. And so he's exposed to all kinds of things. When he's married on their honeymoon, it's very, very elliptical in the letters and the diaries. It's not the reason why you talk about privilege. They went to the hot springs, they went to Virginia. They also went to Hampton Inn in Virginia. And that's where he sees, and he and his wife Josephine, the newlyweds, on their honeymoon, they go and they tour the Freedmen's Institute, where Booker T. Washington had been. And he's actually interested. This is from the point of view of, this is what I was saying about bettering those who have less. It is from a position of power and privilege. Although he didn't have tremendous privilege or power yet, he's certainly already climbing. And every step of the way, it's very deliberate. Marriage, I mean, I talk about, I don't replicate the entire 500 something names, but he does a bit of social engineering. Who are the women who are going to be most likely to help me, use your word, good word, succeed and towards success? It's all towards success, but to give a leg up. It's not quite noblesse oblige, because there's certainly not nobility. But when he comes back so he's looking, how can we help the freedmen? And it's the beginning of a kind of a political sensibility, politics as a way of improving. After the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, again, Irish and Italian, Catholics, non-Jews, he's on the board. He's put on the board by the mayor and the aldermen, and then by Al Smith, Irish Catholic governor. He's very close to Al Smith. Skipping forward in the 1930s, all while they're vacationing at the places of the real old line Knickerbockers. Henry Jr.'s best friend is Franklin Roosevelt, the ultimate Knickerbocker. While they are not just in proximity, but really in the heart of the heart of the heart, the inner sanctum of wealth and privilege in New York society, they have cooks. They have Irish and Scottish cooks. They have Irish and Scottish nannies, wet nurses. So there is, of course, extraordinary privilege. And yet they're breaking in their own way boundaries and barriers, almost unthinking of it, which is the privilege. So Bob Morgenthau goes to prep school. He's president of this, president of that. And I would ask people, was that unusual for a Jewish kid from New York? We didn't think of him as Jewish.
This is so interesting to me because without having known this kind of history of the Morgenthau's and the NAACP, and I totally understand when you said you had to cut. I cut like 40% of my book before it ever hit. It was just never going to be published. So I wanted to ask you, without that story, it kind of like leads to a question of, is there a relationship between the kind of segregation? Well, it seems like, very segregated, because they were Jewish, but they still had the privilege of being white.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Oh, and they never, I mean, it's in the book. At the height of the war, the height of the Holocaust, when Henry Jr., the Treasury Secretary, is having this moral awakening, if not a religious awakening, he says, boys, let me tell you, I went to a Seder last night for the first time. In Daytona, which I pointed out, he was staying to your great question again, I sound like a broken record, he's staying in a hotel that he is told, it's not just me, he's told by a woman, Mr. Secretary, why are you staying there? They don't allow Jews.
Right.
But they allowed Secretary Morgenthau. And he's invited by the Jews of Daytona, Florida, to a Seder. He had never been to a Seder before. And he writes to the boys, this is who were at war. This is an extraordinary thing. The Jews, whether it be in the remnants of the Ottoman Empire, where everywhere he went, including Palestine, the American ambassador, are a nuisance. The Jews are special pleaders. And in Washington during the Holocaust, the Jews are special pleaders. There are many, obviously, communities of Jews, different constituencies, but that's not what Henry Morgenthau Jr. or Sr. wanted to be. You mentioned it. He didn't want to be a special pleader. He didn't want to be seen as occupying the Jewish seat. He wanted to be an American first. And therefore, given their financial status and the proximity to power, their allegiances, they are able to build those bridges, but it really begins in extraordinary fashion back in Germany with Lazarus, expanding bridges all the way to the DA becoming very close ally and friend with Cardinal O'Connor, as well as with not just Martin Luther King, but men whose careers he made. Charlie Rangel, long-serving congressman from Harlem. Many of his proteges he brought, if not the first cohort of Black and brown prosecutors. They were prosecutors for the state in the Southern District, all of whom went on to illustrious careers with his help.
Well, this is interesting. I know, of course, I remember Charles Rangel, because he was a St. John's Law grad, and then also, and he was in New York. And Frank Thomas, the person you mentioned.
Frank Thomas, Sterling Johnson, also women, not many women. Again, it's like Mrs. Roosevelt moving from, the Jew party to being, kind of never a rabid anti-Semitism, but an anti-Semitism that was just in the oxygen until she realizes, wait a minute, my friend Eleanor Morgenthau has been blackballed from a club, a women's club in New York. So I too will resign. That's when
Well,
she's standing.
right.
That's when she's standing up.
When
And that's really,
she's not
sorry.
segregated from Jews, and she becomes friends with somebody who is Jewish, so close she was
Right.
to
Well, that's why, there's no one like, in my book, no one like Eleanor Roosevelt, and she steals the limelight because she had Joan Morgenthau, the secretary's daughter, a debut, and by rights she shouldn't be a debutante as a young Jewish woman in the White House. It was one of the few coming out parties, and Mrs. Roosevelt convenes the social reporters, and they are aghast. You can read the reports. They are aghast that the Roosevelts are turning the White House into a stage for Joan Morgenthau. And Joan Morgenthau didn't want it. She becomes a doctor, and to your point again, opens the first adolescent youth clinic in East Harlem out of a trailer in New York City, and one of the first adolescent medical clinics dealing not just with they weren't called opioids, but heroin treatment in the country, and was a long-standing eminent pediatrician who was teaching in New York until her 80s. And she too is often overlooked. But there is throughout the family, and again, it's liminal. It's not because there is a kind of sense to this day that you wear it lightly. The DA's daughter, eldest daughter, Jenny Morgenthau, was head of the Fresh Air Fund, which is a philanthropy that's very well known for many, many decades. You don't advertise it. You don't advertise it. And I'm moreover, a biographer rooting around in their family past, and certainly an interloper.
So yeah, in the book, Andrew, you said that there are various times where you talk about racial discrimination, where you talked about Bob and Martha living in the segregated New York City housing and Peter Cooper Village, which was created after the war. So it's so surprising that it's right. Maybe not so much for people who know New York City history. Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, is right behind me, and that how Morgenthau, this is Robert, was concerned about civil rights starting in the 1950s. And so I was wondering, he has these two major challenges in terms of cases when he's Manhattan DA. One, which, as you said, which is a great quote, how he says the Central Park jogger case is going to be like the case written on his tombstone, that both deal with race relations. And in it, this is on page 802, you talked about how the DA, quote, refused to entertain questions of race, that he was, and he talked about that later, where he says, this is not about race relations. And when I read the book and I kind of saw that thread of the family, and there's so little about race until the Second World War, about Black Americans specifically. Right. I thought, is this the legacy of segregation, that when Bob Morgenthau is in the DA's office, he literally, this is like a path dependency issue. He literally can't see it because it had not been passed down to him, not from society, not from his networks, his privileged networks, the Roosevelts and so on, the financial communities, had not been passed down to him. And so now he's confronted with this really big issue. Is this what we're seeing, this kind of legacy? But you were suggesting that there's actually more that in the family that was cut. And so I'd love to hear what you think about that.
I think two things can exist at once. I think they did grow up in a closeted world of privilege, where I did read, just to think of the great clam bakes that the Morgenthaus and the Roosevelts, they would vacation together, and in Key West in Florida on a houseboat. They went upstate through the Erie Canal on a campaign swing. They were very, very close. And one of the things that they always did was the Morgenthaus would lay out clam bakes. Eleanor Roosevelt hated cooking. She was a horrible cook, and Roosevelt loved to eat. He was, actually lonely and alone in his condition, but the most gregarious, the center of every party. So it seemed. And the Morgenthau's gave him that stage at the farm. One of the things that they did, though, and I researched this, was they would have Black musicians come and perform. And so here you have privileged Knickerbocker old white families, or old in the sense of having been here a long time, and not Arabis, but new German Jewish families coming in and joining together in Dutchess County. And where were these Black musicians coming from? It's I spent a lot of time trying to find out who were these people and just trying to recreate that scene. But here you literally have a spectatorship. You have spectators and people are performing. And I thought that is a metaphor for the relationship between the races right then. And this is in the 1920s through the 30s. It's a very, very complicated relationship in the political class to unpack. Woodrow Wilson, of course, today is being revisited as a very different character vis-a-vis race relations in the 1910, 1912. Morgenthau saw Henry Sr., Woodrow Wilson, as someone coming to the ethnic constituencies of New York, to the Germans, to the Poles, and to the Jews, and to the Russian Jews. That's the beginning of retail politics. And yet, he's also the guy who tells Henry, you should go to Turkey as ambassador for the sake of your co-religionists, the Hebrews.
Well, he's also the guy who resegregated the federal government.
Absolutely, absolutely. Right. And Josephus Daniels is making common cause with Henry Morgenthau Sr., that he becomes Secretary of the Navy, is a rabid racist and anti-Semite. And there's a number of characters. We don't have time to get into all of them. Charles Crane, who's his co-chair in the finance committee for Wilson, meets with Hitler in 1933. So there's Charles Lindbergh, Father Coughlin. These are not characters you would like to see associating. So for those who were at the origin and then throughout the growth of the NAACP, for instance. And yet both things can exist at once. You can be a member of the family and present when Black musicians are the paid entertainment after the Roosevelt clam bake and bid farewell. You can have the servants, the chauffeurs, not all of whom, but very few of them were Black or brown. But Roosevelt's valets were the men who carried him physically until the night he died, and Henry Jr. is there. I spent a lot of time researching the woman who was the cook and the housekeeper nominally for Roosevelt, but she was really one of Roosevelt's closest confidants, who's with him the day he dies, and Henry is there the night before. And very little is either known or written about, this is the White House staff. Right. Very little is known or written about them, but historians will come. But I was, of course, was amazed, asking myself the same question and interrogating the letters, the documents, the historical record in exactly the same way. How can you come to the DA? How can you come from that family having been, Mrs. Roosevelt was practically his second mother, Eleanor Roosevelt, the champion not only of women's rights, but of human rights, the UN, and a great champion of anyone who had less and who needed more. How can you live in the world of prep school, Amherst, Yale law, and then come in to the citadel of the Southern District and enforce the law and not think about those who do, as one of my teachers would say, who clean the bedpan? And he did think about it, but he didn't necessarily act on it. The big differences, which you alluded to, is the war. World War II. Bob Morgenthau does something, and I really, really spent months, if not years, trying to reconstruct the archival evidence of the claim that I put Black they were called messmen. They were not allowed to rank men in the U.S. Navy.
Right.
He put them on the guns in contravention not only of practice, but perhaps even law. And he did. And, that was extraordinary. And they served bravely. And I was able to interview everyone, not everyone, but as many as I could, dozens of men who were still alive, veterans of his 54 months of active duty in both in the Mediterranean and in the Pacific. And they all said, yeah, we knew his dad was the Secretary of the Treasury, but what Morgenthau did was extraordinary. He was 19, 20, 21 years old, executive commander, so the number two, not the captain, but the number two, the guy that did the real work. And that's where Morgenthau really changes the world, because privilege didn't matter there. They knew who his father was, but if he wasn't a good leader, a military leader on the ship, and the first ship got sunk, 49 men were killed. He, of course, was an officer, all white again. The wardroom, the officers' room, they weren't called servants, but they were the messmen who did the cooking. There was a cooking and a cleaning and a serving school, and that's what they graduated. That was their relationship, serving and being served. And yet he invited those men, whether they volunteered or not, I don't know, but they certainly served with him first in the Mediterranean on those guns, which is the most dangerous position on this destroyer in this case. And then went with him again when he had a new ship after the USS Lansdale was shot down and sunk, to the Pacific. So there's an incredible willingness to serve. And then even when he goes into politics, they go on the campaign trail, several of them. Several of these men who were injured in service are then now asked to join the campaign trail, first for governor in 1962, when Morgenthau was led to slaughter Nelson Rockefeller. And then even again in 1970, when he had a very short abortive run, he liked to forget his second attempt to be governor of New York. But those veterans are enlisted again. And this is a pattern that, as U.S. Attorney, he did it. We mentioned Charles Rangel, Frank Thomas. He is offering a leg up to those who are qualified and able. Charlie Rangel's father and grandfather, again, the serving. He was the elevator operator in the Manhattan DA's office. And Rangel was denied an internship, even though he was an outstanding student. A story that he told me and that Bob Morgenthau also told me. These are a handful of people.
Well, you made that a point about him staffing the DA's office with veterans. And I think it really makes the case about the significance, not only of wartime experience, right? Because I think that experience that you're talking about, the kind of life and death experience of veterans, where differences seem to matter less, hopefully, right? Even in segregated ranks, is a very common story in US history with the Second World War, but is also really a story about the significance of desegregation, about when you see people as human beings.
Right.
I mean, literally in the moment of like, you're gonna die, right? And you see each other as humans, what the possibilities are actually, for that interaction. And you see that in his story. I mean, the way that you tell the story of the family, and they're kind of buffeted in it, they're very powerful, they're very privileged, but they're also kind of buffeted by the waves of what's happening in society around them. I don't think it's an accident that Bob Morgenthau is different from his great-grandfather in thinking about civil rights in the 1950s, because that's what's happening in the society around him. As you said, he didn't necessarily, there's a point in your book, which I thought was so interesting, where you say that he thinks civil rights is really important, but he was really concerned at that moment in his work in organized crime. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that moment.
No, it's both things existing at once. He's driven by a sense of purpose, which is when he's U.S. Attorney, the Chief Federal Office, the Chief Federal Prosecutor in the Southern District, or DA for 35 years. It's the integrity of the office. It's without fear or favor, bringing the charges, whether they be against the richest members of American society. The head of the stock exchange, he indicts. Louis Wolfson, he indicts twice in 1 year. No one remembers Louis Wolfson, but he was known as the junk man. He was the first conglomerator who was of Russian Jew. He completely erased his past. Louis Wolfson was of German Jewish origins and literally rose from a junkyard to build a fortune through all kinds of machinations. Morgenthau takes on Democrats, he takes on Jews, he also takes on the mafia. And at the same time, he's not a civil libertarian. He's aware, obviously, of civil rights. But it's almost through a reticence to prosecute. He's not going to move the goalposts forward other than hiring a very few of the best and the brightest. You know, you mentioned St. John's. All of these people, and they were almost all men, said the great thing about Bob Morgenthau, first in the Southern District and then in the DA's office, which is really a legacy that continues, is he broke down the barrier, not just across race and class. Well, it is obviously race and class. From the Ivies, it's not just Yale Law where he went, or Harvard Law, but the New York schools, the euphemism of New York schools. And if you went to law school, even better. If you were a farmer and you knew how to drive a tractor or a forklift, or if you had served up until you know the 1990s to 2000s, he looked on you with favor as a candidate. And of course he did, you know, as DA, he absolutely expanded the office in terms of women. He absolutely expanded the office in terms of Black and brown young prosecutors coming in. Did he do more than anyone else in the country? It's hard to say. He did start the first anti-bias unit, which interestingly enough, I know you want to talk about the Central Park jogger case, as do I. The woman at the heart of that controversy, Linda Fairstein, was the one who said to me, Andrew, you need to understand what Bob Morgenthau did when he first came, because she had actually started under Frank Hogan, his predecessor, who had also been there for 3 decades. And Frank Hogan was an old school Irishman who didn't want women prosecuting homicides because it might, you know, it's something unseemly that women shouldn't be subjected to. Morgenthau really changed a lot of that. And Linda Fairstein, many others told me as well, that he opened the doors not just for women, but for people of color, and also for not just bias cases, but child abuse cases, a lot of places where people didn't want to go before. Although he wasn't a civil libertarian. He was not a civil libertarian.
I was actually going to ask you, Fairstein, because I didn't know you get to interview her, and she, you know, the Central Park jogger case, and then how it was revealed about the fact that the boys were innocent, the kind of you know, resistance to the evidence when it first came out, when Reyes confessed. That whole part of the book is so interesting. That into the section on incarceration and Bob Morgenthau's legacy on incarceration.
Well, it's to you know, your overriding question. The undercurrent of race, or the overcurrent of race, the undertow of race in this city and in this country. You know, Cyrus Vance, Morgenthau's immediate successor, his chosen heir, whom he turned against. I don't want to give away too much, but he turned against him. There's a King Lear moment where he regrets wrongly. I think he's actually too harsh on Cyrus Vance, but Vance tells me, Andrew, that's the case that will never go away. He said this is after the settlement and the reversal of 2002, long after it. He said, Andrew, I had protesters at my office today, and it's still the case. It's not, we're not finished litigating it. And one of those 5 young men who lost their youth to incarceration in New York State jails, Yusuf Salam, is running for city council right now, and the case will be relitigated again. It again, 2 things might be incompatible, but they exist, they coexist. One, yes, Morgenthau met Martin Luther King. Yes, he took John Kennedy Jr. To the Covenant Baptist Church in Harlem for Martin Luther King Day annually. Yes, Black leaders across New York City and across the country saw Morgenthau as a friend. He also relied on them, not just Charlie Rangel, which I say again and again in the book.
Yeah.
How are we doing uptown? Is
Well,
Harlem?
the legacy,
is Harlem?
of the Civil
Yeah.
Rights Act. Once Black people could vote and had political power, then they actually emerged in the narrative as having some pull, where you have
Right.
to pay attention to their vote in New York. I mean, you really
Right.
see that in the book.
Right. Well, and you know, I'm not going to do a sequel, despite what Mr. Carroll suggested. You know, he whispered that it should be 3 volumes. That's not going to happen.
Like he's LBJ.
Yeah, I said it's not LBJ. Although he knew Bob Morgenthau, and he, I actually shouldn't joke. I mean, I was very, very fortunate to have his support. Robert Carroll's and other great historians as well, saying, when I wasn't sure, should I do 2, 3, 4 generations? Carroll, among others, said, it's a great book, you've got to do. You know, of course he would go for the long arc.
Right.
You know, 12, 13 years later, here we are. But I think, and it's a question I'm asked a lot, what would Bob Morgenthau think of Alvin Bragg? And what would he think about the change? Vance is really a transitional character in that office. 12 years, Cyrus Vance, but he too is a son of patrician New York. His father had been Secretary of State. Alvin Bragg is a son of Harlem. He's Harvard Law educated, but he is a son of Harlem. We are in a very, very different place than we were in 2009 when Morgenthau left that building after 35 years. And yet, Alvin Bragg invited me back to talk about this book and the Morgenthau legacy. And so, you know, history matters. I don't need to tell you or anyone listening to this, history matters. And in this city, it matters a great deal. And when you have an incident, and in that case in 1989, in April 1989, which is known as the Central Park jogger case, there were many attacks. There was the brutal rape of Patricia Miley that becomes known, unfortunately, as the Central Park jogger. But there were other attacks that night too. It was a crazy night in the sense that there was a confluence of so many different forces at play. In New York City, whether it's the Washington Square riot in 1976, that was Morgenthau's first big political case that was a real race imbroglio in the middle, in daylight, early evening in Washington Square in Lower Manhattan. 9 minutes of a melee that left a man dead. That case was all but forgotten when I started asking people about it. Very few people, even the prosecutors, and then this is it's several chapters in the book, but then I published a abridged version of it in the Times Metropolitan section. People wrote me afterwards asking the same questions. The cops were involved. Black police officers were involved. Why did this happen? This was shunted out, you know, and so it was an enormously complex case that was all but forgotten. And Morgenthau, you know, was kind of wondering, well, why are you writing about that case? Again, he didn't see it as, you know, one of the, I did 5 cases, as you know. He didn't see it as one of the 5 cases that should be illustrative and of his 35 years. But you can't talk about law and order in New York City without talking about race.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I love what you said about the undertow of race in the city. You know, when you're a New Yorker, you just really understand. I mean, just in the way that our neighborhoods are segregated, you know, and you kind of,
And our schools are segregated.
Oh yeah, 100%. The King Lear moment that you talked about, the fact that 2 things can exist at the same time. I feel like, I think these are all so insightful statements. When you're talking, and I think we probably have to wrap up, so I want this to be the last question. A lot of your projects, as you said, Alvin Bragg is asking you to come back, are really looking at history like New York or Russia? I mean, I'm thinking about what's happening in Ukraine. People must be asking you all the time to talk about the history of Russia and what you think about what's going on right now with the war in Ukraine. Because your project's really about like kind of the center of power. And, you know, whether it's in New York or globally. And I know that people are going to want me to ask you what you're working on next and what your next project is going to be, or if you're exhausted by your book tour and
No,
you're
no,
working on
no,
this book and you're taking a break. But
actually,
knowing writers, I feel like you must be working on something else.
yeah, actually, thank you. It's a great question. I'm not going to give you a lousy answer. I'm 3 years into a new book. It actually, I did not wait. I delivered a very, very large manuscript because of COVID. I had to physically print it out and bring it in.
Oh my goodness.
Well, I would have done it anyhow, you know, being known as rather obsessive, overly obsessive. I physically brought it in, and the day I handed in this stack of very tall stack of paper to Random House, my publisher, I went down the block and interviewed someone for the next book.
Oh, what is it?
That afternoon. So it's interesting to hear you frame Russia, and I've never heard it put that way. So you've given me a gift. Thank you. More than one tonight, Susie. I hadn't really thought about Russia and New York politics as nexus of power, and really the legacies of, you know, obviously bringing the past to the present. I try to see what's unseen, but that's what we try to do, is bring the past back and learn those lessons. It's about Vietnam, and it's complete. Again, I'm doing something that probably isn't necessarily useful or wise to advise anyone else to do, but I'm changing. If not themes, I'm changing continents entirely.
Wow. Do you mean about the war or about something else?
It's a dual, but it's shaping up as a dual. I don't want to get too deep into it because I'm still thinking through it, even though I'm 3 years into the research. I'm keeping an open mind, a very open mind, and I know that it'll be very different. It's going to be a short book, and it's
these are going to be your famous last words. I will the next time you come back to the center.
Well, I did a lot of reading, a lot of fiction reading when I was finishing Morgenthau, and I read Marilyn Robinson, and she seems to always do about 215 pages. I don't know if it'll be that short, or it certainly won't be that brilliant. But I was reading a lot of fiction, and I was like, you know, sometimes less is more. And so I did cut. This is useful advice, and it comes from Robert Caro. You know, if it's several hundred pages on LaGuardia and it's not in a book, you know, it's got to go. I think that is good advice. So yeah, it's going to be on Vietnam, and it's going to be a biography, and hopefully it will have similar lessons about power and privilege and those who and how those served. So that's deliberately mystifying.
Yes, no, it's great. You keep us
hopefully somewhat enticing, without being too cheeky.
No, that's great. We're really looking forward to it. Well, I want to thank you so much for talking to us about your book. I really learned a lot from it. Just a level of detail. I mean, as I said earlier, it is really an epic accomplishment. So I hope you are at least taking a tiny break to kind of celebrate what you've done, because I think that's important to do that as a writer. And I want to thank the Gotham Center of the City of New York and CUNY, and also Peter for hosting us today. So I guess we should sign off and say good night to everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Susie. It's fantastic. It's a monumental task you were given, and you did great. And I learned so much from you. Those are really good. I'm going to be continuing to think of your questions, because they do not lend themselves to one or an easy answer.
Oh, sorry.
You were breaking up. I don't know if I could.
I was going to remind everyone that if they had questions that they wanted to ask you, that they could go to your website, which is www.andrewmeyer.com, and email you questions. You can also email me at paks1@stjohns.edu and ask me any questions, or I can also forward them to Andrew. And you can also email the Gotham Center as well if you would like to give feedback or questions on the talk. But you were going to say something. I think you were going to thank Peter.
Yeah, thank Peter and thank the Gotham and the Graduate Center, which even though I do teach at the New School, I think that CUNY is the most democratic lowercase d institution in our city. And thank you all, obviously, for taking the time to listen to me ramble. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Susie. I stand in your debt.